Neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves. Endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us once again one of the most erudite members of the bar in New York State, Judge Tom Engel. Welcome, Tom.
Very nice to be with you, Dr. Robinson, as I've enjoyed coming down to Macon for many years.
Well, it's great to have you here from another part of the world and down to our, I guess, Arcadian hills and dales here. It's good to have you with us. Now, the election has taken place. We're having our conversation actually the night before the election, and I don't doubt that whatever has occurred has caused a lot of societal tension. There are a lot of people that have been disappointed, bruised in the process, and it's extremely important to try and bring the country together as best we can. What would happen? I mean, you're aware of people in New York State that are going to take this the wrong way. And I know that you live in Manhattan to some degree, and which is a very, I guess, pro-Hillary place. If Hillary were to lose, what do you think people would think about it? Would they be very angry? Would they be upset? What would be the response?
I think certainly with many of the people my wife and I see every day and night, I think their first reaction would be incredulity. They simply wouldn't believe that somebody like Mr. Trump could be elected, and that the flyover states, if you will,
yes,
had the temerity and the impudence to elect somebody as vulgar, if you will, certainly as unqualified, at least in their view, as he is, and so. In that sense, I think liberals, despite the sound of that word, and the progressives, if you will, a label they've come to prefer, I think there's a certain arrogance about their intellectual judgment and their political preferences that makes it very hard for them to accept something that they regard not only as retrograde, but as primitive.
Yes. Well, and I mean, in a way, the idea is the democratic process is going to produce the right outcome, and so I think the liberal viewpoint would be, well, if people really understand the real deal, they're going to choose my direction because that's the morally correct one. And on the other side of the street, the polls say it would be more likely that Donald Trump would be defeated. And the question that's often asked is with that outcome, and in fact, it's been asked several times in these political debates, to Donald Trump, are you going to accept the election? And so the question, it's almost like jury nullification. I mean, the voters say, well, we're going to just nullify the people on the right, and agreed on the left, they may just go through a process of, in their minds, I'm not going to accept whoever the president is. I'm just not going to accept that process. And then there'll be allegations, or maybe on both sides, that some kind of corrupt arrangement occurred. Particularly, I think, on the right, people would say, well, all kinds of unregistered voters appeared in big cities. There'd be a lot of tensions that presumably are going to be taking place now, no matter what the outcome is. And the question to ask is, what kind of suggestions can be made to diminish these tension issues? And it would appear to me a lot involves the victorious, both the defeated candidate and the victorious candidate. It's going to be really important for whoever the victor is to extend the olive branch and make great efforts to assuage the concerns of the defeated party. I mean, do you have thoughts about that and any?
Well, I guess I do. I mean, I think it is in this election, that's going to be a very, very tall order, because if Mrs. Clinton is elected, the legal problems that she has experienced and will continue to experience through the investigation of the foundation, if nothing else, will continue to dog her. And if Mr. Trump is elected, the political establishment that he wants to turn upside down will feel as if they not only have been defeated but expelled, and the way of doing business in Washington will have changed forever. So I think you're talking about two very substantial problems, one cultural and one criminal, that are going to create a problem that will continue to dog the process afterwards. Of course, a lot of it depends on what the Congress looks like. If Mrs. Clinton were to prevail, then and were to prevail substantially, and Mr. Trump were only to, say, take, I don't know, 10 or 15 states, then Trump's candidacy would have been exposed as a kind of a fraud on the Republican Party, never mind the country. But if she is only narrowly victorious and the Republicans hang on to the Senate, then it's a somewhat more balanced situation. I'm assuming that the Republicans will hold on to the House. But certainly one of the great motivators in people who are voting for Mr. Trump is the composition of the Supreme Court since the death of Justice Scalia in February. Justice Scalia was a legitimate hero to judicial and political conservatives, and certainly one of the most powerful judicial voices, certainly in my lifetime. And I've been a lawyer for a long time now, over 40 years. He was a remarkable creature and a remarkable voice that changed the court, not only in conservative directions, I might add, but in what would be perceived as liberal directions. So you have this third branch of government whose role in this election is really pretty critical. And if conservatives see the Senate go and a Democratic Senate were to follow the lead of what Vice Presidential candidate Kaine has suggested, which is that they will not respect a filibuster in respect of a Supreme Court nominee, then that will have major consequences for the way in which a Clinton presidency is perceived, and will make it seem the less legitimate to people on the right. So a lot of it really depends on what the composition of the legislature, of the Congress, is after this. Incidentally, unlike many people, I did not have a particular problem with the concept that Mr. Trump announced, that he would look at the results after they came in to determine what his reaction or response would be. I think he was a little awkward in the way he described it, but we need go back no further than the election of George Bush in 2000 over Al Gore, and Al Gore was expressing his discontent with the way in which the result was achieved, particularly obviously in Florida, as late as the month of December. So I didn't have a real problem with what he said. He was a little awkward and bumptious in the way he said it.
Well, as we look at the situation, it appears to me one of the things that's important is the victor in the election, whoever that is, and I'm going to assume that polls are saying it's going to be Hillary Clinton, although who knows? If it's Donald Trump, these things happen. But the victor really needs to say, well, look, I've got to govern the country. It's very polarized. And the idea of extreme legislation or extreme action on either side needs to be very carefully nuanced. And I would say Hillary, despite all of the defects that are fairly obvious, and we've had discussions about that, has been in the political process and knows about how to do deals. And one can hope that the terrible rhetoric that was out there, the basket of deplorables, all the sort of assaults against the respective voters of each party, that it really needs to stop right away, and some huge effort at healing needs to occur, and the Republican establishment should step forward. And in general, all of the institutions that we have need to make, in my opinion, a major effort to diminish the social tension that's out there.
Let me just interrupt you for a second and say, you know, it really, again, depends on the nature of the result. If Trump's candidacy is discredited by a lopsided win
Yes.
for Mrs. Clinton, then he is not going to constitute in any way the Republican establishment, as
Yes,
you call
right,
it.
yes.
If, on the other hand, he loses narrowly, he might well complain that had the Republican establishment that is more well known and preceded him had in fact behaved themselves, then he might have been the victor indeed.
Yes.
So there may be some internecine squabbling and fighting about the nature of the Republican Party that follows this. And as I've said before, Mrs. Clinton's own legitimacy is going to be undermined to a great degree by the criminal problems that have dogged her thus far, and absent a pardon by President Obama or even a pardon of herself by herself, would continue to dog her. And of course, that would be a greater problem, again, if the complexion of the House, for example, is more conservative than some people are predicting, and the Senate is held by the Republicans. Certainly, if there is a landslide and the Senate becomes Democratic and Mrs. Clinton wins by a lot, which I'm not predicting at all. I don't have no idea. You know, she will have less incentive to compromise and to reach across the aisle.
Yes. Well, as one thinks about this, I'm troubled by just the intensity of the political opinions that are appearing in each party. I guess the word might be hatred. It really is a pretty unseemly disdain for each party is tremendously contemptuous of the other candidate, more so than I can recollect in my lifetime, though people remark that in the 19th century, certainly these periods of confrontation and ill will, or several times that's happened, but it does seem pretty extreme, and I wonder if the country's interests are going to be well served by that. And just one comment I'll make is the one thing that needs to be considered substantially is the idea of the purity of the electoral process. And so I think the idea the courts are saying the most important thing for us is all comers get to vote, and the idea that the door is open, and if by chance a few voters vote that should not, well, that's not such a big deal. But maybe it is if there's going to be some kind of dispute about the integrity of the voting process, and it's something that I would suggest the judicial branch of government needs to consider when they make these decisions, which pretty much have thrown out every effort to secure the sanctity of the voting place. You have a comment on that?
Well, I mean, both sides have complaints. I mean, the Democrats complain that various statutes, I think one recently in North Carolina, for example, make the ID that is produced by prospective voters a bigger issue, and makes it hard for minority voters because some of them don't have driver's licenses, or some of them don't speak English, or what have you. So they complain about that, and the Republicans complain that that dead people are voting,
Yes.
particularly in heavily Democratic precincts in our larger cities. I have no doubt that happens, and our system is porous in this respect. For example, my wife and I vote upstate New York, not in Manhattan, but I think 2 or 3 children are still registered to vote up there when they haven't been on the rolls, and they have been leading adult lives one in Connecticut and one in Manhattan for years. That presumably happens all the time, and somebody could vote in the morning in Connecticut and vote in the evening in Rhode Island, or in Georgia, or in Florida, or even in different counties in the same place. So I don't know. I'm not enough of a psephological expert to understand voting and voting patterns and registration and limits on this. And I think the courts are not actually well equipped to do this either, because so often these challenges come up only in the context of these quadrennial contests, when a lot seems to be at stake, and challenges come, sometimes very late in the day.
Well, yes. Well, apparently, I mean, it's many times the votes have been, use the word, the electoral process has been rigged on the right and rigged on the left in regards to who has the privilege of voting. Certainly in the South, in the earlier days, I mean, the literacy tests were there. They're basically, and there was the Democratic primary, so there are all kinds of obstructions that occurred to minimize minority turnout. So that's certainly been the case. But one can wonder, it would be the incidences where the people are denied the vote. It's pretty unusual, I would say. And on the other hand, if the process is thought to be contaminated, it really causes people not to accept the election. You get into really, and of course the Democrats felt they were wronged in 2000 when Al Gore had more votes than did George Bush, but the Electoral College went against him. So the person that had the most votes that wasn't elected. And additionally, what's occurring is that it's likely the winner of the electoral process has received a minority of votes. It's a plurality, but not a majority of votes, because there's several candidates out there. And we have the voting age population is some big number and a relatively small percentage of voted. So we have these issues out there in the legitimacy of our electoral process. And no matter what happens, just getting a lot of attention being directed to that, I think, would be appropriate, so that at least that's removed from I guess, the political discourse, that people really believe the election has been fair. There's an agreed upon way, and to me, there could be a situation where you just, for whatever reason, you don't have the appropriate identification to vote, and every opportunity has been given to you to have it, then, I mean, you might not be able to vote. That'd be my thought about it. Sure. There's some kind of limit on the damage that would occur if there were absolutely no restraints in getting to the ballot box. And because of the fact that we do have such porous borders, and that many people are, for one reason or another, are not citizens, or they're felons. They might vote, or they might vote multiple times. There's interesting questions that I think would be in the country's benefit to get these issues dealt with. So at least as we try and solve the country's dilemma, that everyone reposes confidence in the voting.
Well, let me just stop you there, though, because one of the problems that you put your finger on are the way in which the votes are cast by whom, and all of that is largely controlled by the states. So you're not going to have, or be able to have, it seems to me, the country as a whole, which was the phrase you used, somehow clean up this effort. It's sure the cases are heard by federal judges usually, but it's each state's franchise that has to be looked at. The victors in cases like this can usually point to the fact that although there was this irregularity in this county, or these votes of all these dead people in Chicago were thus and such, that the majorities in each state are substantial enough that whatever irregularities may have been alleged or may even have occurred were not enough to have carried that state for the candidate for whom one contends. I don't think that was necessarily true in 1960 when Kennedy took the state of Illinois by very narrow margins with very suspect majorities coming out of the city of Chicago. But I think that was a fairly unique occurrence. In any event, it certainly would not serve the country well to have a lot of brush fires following the election concerning the legitimacy of the votes cast if we want to get on with making this democracy that we have federally as healthy and as competent, really, as it might be. Again, I keep coming back to the legislature. If the Congress is Republican, and myself and a lot of other people seem to think that's the way the country likes things, at least in the sense that they have divided government.
Yes.
An executive of one party and a Congress of another, that would seemingly at least balance power and allow leadership in the White House and in the Capitol to show us the way. But even there, President Obama, it was a really horrible example of how to do that, because whenever he tried to work with the Congress, and he rarely ever did try, and the Congress didn't do what he wanted them to do, he would simply pass some sort of executive order that the Congress, I think with some legitimacy, felt was an unconstitutional appropriation of power by the executive. And that's not a trend that started with President Obama by any means. Republicans have been guilty of it as well, although not to the extent that this president has. He has really, I think, perverted the nature of the separation of powers.
Yes. Well, that's a big issue, isn't it? So we have the what presumably we're speculating these tussles can continue. I keep pushing for some kind of national consensus about diminishing societal tension. Well, I've sort of submitted maybe trying to say that the electoral process was fair. Another extension of that word is just a fair society, or what is fair. That's a very tricky word. And assuming that Donald Trump is defeated, his supporters are going to think the electoral process was not fair. They'll also believe that, and I think Donald Trump has played this a lot, the system is rigged against his supporters, the people, as you mentioned, that live in the flyover country, that are outside the urban cities, that might be of European descent. They're in small towns. Their economic situation is not the best. The jobs have been exported. All all the sort of buttons that Donald Trump touched. Presumably, I would say that one of the things to do is to consider fairness in all quarters. So fairness for one person might be taking something away from another person. But the idea is the victors of this process need to really consider the notion of fairness for all comers, for all citizens. And the fact that Donald Trump had so many people that supported him in this that didn't believe the system is fair, assuming the Democrats are in power, which might not be the case, it's going to be extremely important for the victors to try and say, I intend to be a fair president for all comers. And the rhetoric that's been used to be elected on both sides, that really needs to be diminished. I'd say one of the things that happened in this electoral cycle is the restraint that's normally been exercised by political candidates in criticizing one another or ad hominem attacks against each other. That's really been stripped away.
Well,
getting back to a sense of civility is going to be extremely important. That'd be my thought about it.
Well, I think that's true. I was going to say this earlier, however, when you get to candidates like the ones we have, and I think we all feel we've suffered through these long primary and now general election campaigns, it is not clear that these people are of the moral fiber and of the general personality to bring some sort of pacific ending to this process. Mrs. Clinton has her criminal problems. She's largely viewed by many of the people closest to her as a harridan, as somebody who yells and screams at people, she has not been an attractive candidate, certainly, and people don't have a sense of an illegitimacy about her, in the sense that she's played off her husband's coattails and really tried to set up a dynasty, not just a presidency. And as for him, his behavior and his vulgarity and lewdness and so forth that I've spoken about speak for themselves. He likes to crow about a lot of things. And if he's elected, he will continue to crow, at least about that. Whether he could be have a sense of that he owes more to the country being in that august office is really, the coin is in the air on that. There's nothing in his past that would suggest, for example, a great historical appreciation of what the office of the presidency means, he tends to treat everything as a deal, not in a creative and helpful way, but in a sort of crude and a sense of triumphalism that I don't hold out hope, really, no matter who wins, that the country will be in safe hands, good hands, or sure hands.
Well, do you think, finally, as we approach the end of our conversation tonight, the media really sort of tries to exacerbate these tensions? They get higher ratings, and then people always enjoy a good fist fight, or they say, well, so-and-so is now accusing so-and-so of some heinous crime, or we've just learned that whatever, sort of a New York Post kind of world out there. And there's the sort of restraint that used to be exercised a little bit back in the Walter Cronkite era, about being a little more restrained about what's said on the airways. Doesn't seem to be possible anymore. I mean, the media is just driven by the news cycles and by ratings, and the idea that you're getting disinterested news in the country's interest. I mean, it just does not seem to be the case. I mean, do you have comments about that?
Well,
Could the media help restore the country's civility?
Well, I mean, I think sort of responsible media could, yes, but where is the responsible media? Certainly on the progressive side, the liberal side, we have the New York Times. The New York Times editorial page has been on the front page in their news stories since the minute Mr. Trump
Yes.
was nominated. That's true of the Washington Post. I do think the Wall Street Journal editorial page is what it is, but I don't think it leaks, their editorial position leaks into their news stories anything like the way the progressive press has. In this election, I think it's a brand new ball game, and it's also depressing and does not forecast well for the period following the election, no matter who wins.
Well, Tom, on that unfortunate note of pessimism, we wish the country well as it goes forward in the new era. And it's been great talking to you tonight, and keep them straight up in New York if you can.
We certainly pray for the country.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.